Welcome to my second video in the Step Method Concepts series on pawn endings. Today I'm going to discuss the square of the pawn and the rook pawn. So in this position we see a pawn on c5, and if we draw a diagonal from the pawn on c5 to the back rank, we see that it ends at f8. And then we can create a square using that diagonal. And why is that relevant? If the enemy king steps into that square, and let's say the attacking king is not close, so the king with the pawn, then the enemy king can stop the pawn. So here we see it for the pawn on b4, so it is a 5 by 5 square, and black is to move and cannot step into the square. The king can go to g4, but that's not part of the 5 by 5 square. If we take this pawn and bring it down to b3, the square changes. So now the square becomes a 6 by 6. And the black king could step into the square and stop the pawn if the pawn would be advancing further. So the black king is in time to stop the pawn. Now the question arises, what is the square of the pawn for the pawn on b2? So if I take this pawn and move it to b2, is it b2 to h2 and then to b8 or not? Well, the pawn can make two steps on the first move, so it acts like the pawn on b3, so it has the same square as the pawn on b3. So the square of the pawn on b2, when you want to figure out if you can stop the pawn, is the same as the square of the pawn on b3. So we saw in the previous example that this is the square. So for pawns on the 2nd and 7th rank, it doesn't work to draw a diagonal from the base and then to the back rank, but because you have to realize that a pawn can make two steps at the first move. So let's apply this here. So we see the pawn on a5, and we see that the king on e4 is in the square. So at the moment white can stop the pawn. Black is to move. You can see that if you look to the square next to h1. And the question is, can black not simply play king h5 and then eat this pawn and then go to this pawn? Because the white king has to attend to the pawn on a5. Well, that's not the case, because after king h5, white plays g3 first, because white is not forced to go to the a pawn immediately. And then after king g4, the king starts moving, and at the moment black takes, white runs. And the final position is a draw. So just ignoring the defensive possibilities of white gives white a draw. But we know that the white king cannot go to the f-file, because in that case the white king would be stepping out of the square of the pawn on a5. And we know that the defensive resource of white was g3. So can we use both facts to find a better solution for black? And if you put those two together, then it's of course clear that first you play f5. King cannot take, because then the a pawn promotes. And after king d4, we play first f4, so we fix the g2 pawn, and then we have all the time to capture the pawns and promote and get a winning position. So you can apply this technique also in more complicated positions. Sometimes there is a blockade. So the black king is in the square of the pawn, right? If we would draw a line, you can see that the king is actually in the square of the pawn, but there is a blockade. And the blockade is of the same color, of course, as in this case the black king. And if white, who is to move, pushes their pawn, black cannot go through his own pawn, and then after b7 loses the game. So one of the complications can be that there is a blockade. This was a simple example. So let's have a look at the next diagram. In this case, can you create a blockade so we can promote our b pawn? So we have a pawn on b2, and we concluded that the pawn on b2 can go in one go to b4. The square of the pawn is like this. So at the moment, the black king is in the square, and if white would just play b4, black would play king takes e4, and black would be in time. So does it matter if you start with e5 and then you want to follow up with d5, or do you start with d5 and then follow up with e5? So the problem, if you start with d5, that black doesn't take, but black plays e5, and then if you play b4, white just captures all the pawns and is still in the square. So here we see that it's actually critical that for the blockade to work, it has to be a pawn of the same color. So the difference, if we play e5, right, that after, of course, now d5 by black, it's clear that black can no longer stop the pawn. And if black takes the pawn, now we play d5, and then we push the pawn, and the king is stopped by their own pawn. So for a blockade to work, we need a pawn of the same color. Let's have a look here, and perhaps you want to stop the video and determine how you would continue here, right? I mean, it feels like you want to play. A lot of players, their first suggestion here is to play e5, and then after d takes e4, start running with the g pawn. Does that work? Is that the solution? e5 followed by d takes e5 and then g4. Well, let's first, of course, realize what the square of this pawn is. It's a pawn on the second rank, right? So the square of the pawn is this. At the moment, the black king is in it. And if the white pawn moves to g4, right? So because white is to move, So assume that this pawn is here. This becomes the square of the pawn. So although we can create a blockade on e5, there is now, if you highlight this, an easy way for black to actually get into the square of the pawn, which is to take this pawn. And then black is still in time. So we have to find a different solution. Can we change the move order? Okay. That would mean that instead of starting with e5, we start with g4. So let's analyze the move g4. It's clear now, if the black king takes on c4, that after g5 the king cannot go to d5 because of the pawn on e4. So that doesn't work anymore. So black is forced to play king d4. Now you would say playing e5 doesn't make any sense because the king takes it. That's true. But white plays something else. White plays the move g5, and now we have two pawns separated by a file. And in this case, the king on d4 cannot take the pawn on e4 because then the pawn runs forward. So the king moves up, and now we have to realize that these pawns take away these two squares. And the king can also not approach over this square because then white will play g6. So the only way for white to approach these pawns, for black to approach these pawns, is going like this. It's a long way. So we stop pushing the pawns, right? Because if we would push the pawns, then we would lose it. But instead, we keep this construction in place. And so these two pawns are defending each other, and for the moment, and black has to spend 3 moves to get the king to the right place. We can use those 3 moves to get our own king in the game and get to an easy winning position. So 2 pawns separated by 1 file, they have special powers. In this case, of course, there is pawn on the d file and a lot of pawns on the queen side. So it's not a clean case, but let's explore this a bit further. So here we see 2 pawns separated by 1 file. And if black was to move, black could play king takes a5 and then draw the game. But white plays a6. And now it's impossible for black to take the pawn on a5 because c7 and white would promote. And the only way again for black to approach this c pawn is to go like this. So black makes a move. Now we don't have a move with the pawn, right? If we play a6, the king takes. If we play c7, king b7, and we lose the pawn. So this, though the white king is not close, it is crucial that white has the freedom to make a move. So if the king has no moves, the white king, then the white pawns would fall. So the white king doesn't need to be close, but needs the freedom to make a move. Because white just plays a simple move. King goes back. We play this, and then if the black king goes here, then we play a7, and black can no longer hinder the promotion. So you can see that two pawns separated, right, if we go back, two pawns separated by one file, and it doesn't matter how advanced they are, can protect each other under the condition that the white king, the attacking king you could say, has freedom to move. And I think it's very beautiful. I call them separated at a knight's distance. And you can see actually the squares that they're taking away. In this case, just like in the previous one, we see that those two squares are being taken away. So the king has to go to a7, b8 and c7 to approach them. So let's look at this position. If you want to pause the video and try to see if you can figure out yourself, that would be a good exercise. So let's orient ourselves. The king on c6 is of course guarding the pawn on a6, and if it was black to move, black would play king b6 followed by king takes a6 and then bring the king back and start working with the two connected passes on the king side, g5 and h6. So white doesn't have unlimited time. And of course the first thing a lot of players would start to calculate is, okay, while the black king goes to the a6 pawn, can I as white take this pawn, promote this pawn, and then win the game like this? So that's a good visualization exercise. And so if you would try that, you would see, the question is who promotes first? That as soon as the king of course goes to f6, the black king would not take on a6, but is going to start their own run with the pawn. And we see that black promotes first, and we get into a draw position. Neither side has winning chances here. So just going a brute force with king f5 and making it a pawn race doesn't solve it. So is it possible in this position to create these pawns, two pawns at a knight's distance that protect each other? And if we could get this pawn on c4 to c5, c5 and a6 would be protecting each other. So the way to create it, of course, is to get rid of the pawn on c5 by black, by playing d4. And we can first ask ourselves, is black forced to take? Right? So king b6, and then we play d5, and now you can see that the black king is torn between the pawn on a6 and the promotion of the white pawns. So after taking here, take, we see, right, that the square of this pawn is not very large, and the black king cannot step into it, and it's too late to stop the pawn, and white is winning. So it is impossible for black to ignore the threat, so black has to take. Now white gets their construction they were looking for, with the two pawns at a knight's distance. And now the question becomes, can white stop the two pawns on the king side from black, and also capture the pawn on d4? So it would be logical for black to start h5, we take, and we see that the white king is actually in the square of the pawn on h5. So after h4, right, the square has become h4 to e1, so the king has to step into it. h3, square is again smaller, the king has to step into it. g4 and king g3. So in many situations, this pair of connected pawns would be sufficient to save the game, because white cannot take on g4, because then h2 happens. Unfortunately for black, it is black to move, and black is out of moves. After king takes c5, white plays a7, and then the white pawn promotes. After king d7, we play a7, and the white pawn promotes. And after f6 or f5, this pawn promotes. So, and after f5, of course, we can take en passant. So black has no moves, and because of that, despite having a connected passes, black is lost. This is a game of one of my students. I'd like you just to watch this game. And my student was black, and white could have made a draw with what we just discussed. Two pawns separated by one file at, you could say, a knight's distance. So black was chasing the knight went here, and now we get into the pawn ending. And so find the hidden draw. Black played king a6, centralizing their king. White says, I'm going to the queen side to stop the pawns. And after this sequence, white resigned. So let me go back once. Can you find the hidden draw? So we have bishop takes c5, d takes c5, king e6, king e2, king d5, king d3, take a5, and resign. And the critical moment is here, and this is the pawn duo that can now create two pawns at a knight's distance separated by one file. So after e4, right, you can see what happens, right? Black can say, I'm going for the c6 pawn, and white re-establishes it. Then black says, I'm going to run. White is just in time. And now we have an interesting situation. Both kings have still moves, right? The white king can shuffle between a2 and b3, cannot take the b4 pawn. The black king can shuffle between c6 and c7, cannot go to d8 because that would lose the game, and so this would have been a draw if white had recognized that two pawns separated by a file at a nice distance protect each other. Finally, just to highlight, here we see a position, and the question is, how can black win this, right? If black plays f7, then white loses. So white has to be careful, and white plays e6 to open up the complete 7th rank and increase the activity of the rook even more. And now, of course, the threat is rook a8 with a x-ray attack on the king on d8 and the rook on h8. If black would say I'm going rook h6 to step out of that X-ray attack, then white is immediately winning. So black brings their rook closer to the king, and in this case, after rook a8, king to d7, the rook is defended and there is no issue. White plays f7 and rook f8. And now we are in an interesting situation, right? That the black rook has no moves, because the rook can only take the pawn or go to h8. If the rook goes to h8, there's rook a8 again. So that doesn't give any solution to the problem. And if the king moves to c8, then there's also rook a8. So both the king and the rook have no moves. And you would say here, yes, but look, we have two pawns separated by a file, and they protect each other, right? So everything is okay for black. Well, there was one condition, and the condition was that the black king had to have moves. So the white king is not in the square at the moment of the black pawn. So after this sequence, you can see now black would need, black has no moves with the king to make, and white is winning, because black is forced to play c3, and that loses the game. So the condition that the king is able to move, it doesn't have to be close, it's very important. Let's go to the rook pawn. So in the previous video we saw that for the key squares, we found the key squares for the b to the g pawn. And if the pawns were on their own side, so for white rank 1 to 4, it was 2 moves ahead and then the square in between. And if the pawn was on the 5th to the 8th rank, so for the black side, the 4th to the 1st rank, it would be 1 move ahead and the square in between. For the pawn on h4, the key squares for the attacker are g7 and g8. Generally speaking, right, if you would say, if you are defending and you want to prevent the attacker from obtaining the squares g7 and g8, you are okay if you're on one of these 6 squares, because if you're on f8, the opposing king cannot be on g7 and g8, and this applies for all these 6 squares. So that, if we come back to where we were, the rule is, again, if the side with the pawn has their king on g7 or g8, and if the pawn is safe, so it's not being captured by the opposing king, then in this case white would be winning. It doesn't mean that there are other situations where white is winning, but that's the rule for the key squares of the rook pawn. So in this case, white is the move, right? And white plays king b1, and of course in this case white gets stalemated. So this is the background. But you could see, if black was to move, the black king is not on a key square, the white king is on a defending square, you could say. But despite that all, black would be winning with the move a2, because the king can no longer go to b1. This is also an interesting case, how to make a draw with black. Black plays king f6, What is the threat of king f6? The threat is to go to f7, and that would prohibit the white king from going to those two squares. So that is the threat, and the only way for white to parry that threat is by playing king g8, but now we see the other condition, that the pawn is lost. So this is a very important position to realize, that you would say, oh, white steps onto a key square for the attacking side. Yes, but is losing the pawn in the process. King g5 on the other hand, right, immediately going for this pawn, h6, king f6, too late, and white is winning because the pawn is unstoppable. Let's have a look here. White to play and win, and if white would just play it straight forward without thinking, we can see that black obtains the draw. So what to do with white? Of course, another principle in pawn endings is to shield off the enemy king. And if a king walks over a diagonal or straight, it is the same number of moves. So king c6, right, prevents the black king from going to c5, and first to yes. So king c4, and now after king b7, king c5, king takes a7, king c6, king b8. The black king is too late. So sometimes we have to shield off the enemy king from reaching one of the defensive squares, in this case c7 or c8. In this case, we have not a rook pawn yet. Right? White has a pawn on g2. These are the key squares. And if white could just capture the pawn on h4, they would be on a key square and would be winning. Of course, as soon as the white king approaches, black would push their pawn and change the structure and try to get to an endgame with a rook pawn. And so the strategy for black is to change the structure, go to a rook pawn ending, and then go to one of those two squares and try to make the draw. And you can see, right, if white just goes here, now black says, do I have any more time to delay my moves? No, because after next move the king is on g4, and then after h3 the king can take, and then go to h4 on the next move. So I have to change structure now. And now king d6. And black is preventing the enemy king from getting to one of those key squares. And the position is a draw. Black will shuffle between f7 and f8. So the straightforward method is not working here. And the way for white to play it is to play king f5. Again, the threat is now king g4, taking the pawn and then immediately being on a key square of the pawn on g2. Black cannot delay changing structure. But now we see the difference. That black has no chance. Even if I go here, king d7, king e8, white reaches one of the two key squares and is winning the game. So the move king f5 was a move that threatened to win the pawn on h4 with king g4, but at the same time was a move towards the two critical key squares of the rook pawn. Here, right, if black is to move, you see that next to h1, and if black would just be thinking, okay, let me approach, not enough. White is on one of the two key squares and can just advance the pawn. Of course, black can play a5 and force the white king to go and capture that pawn. And we see that black gets one tempo to reach, you could say, one of the defensive key squares in this case, and it's impossible for white, right? And black would like to play king b8, but here, if we continue, it's not black that's getting stalemated, but it's white that's getting stalemated. Final position. So in this case there are two moves to consider. So it is black to move, but I would like you to find the answer to the black move king d3 and the black move king c3. So what do we see? Currently there is a pawn on b7 from black, and the black king of course is closer to the pawn on a5 than the white king is to the pawn on b7, right? So black can play king c3, king b4, king takes a5, three moves, and for white it would be king e5, king d6, king c7, and take. White has the option to change structure with a5, a6, and then try to get to c1. So there are two strategies. One I call change structure and get to one of the defensive key squares, in this case c1 or c2. The other one I call tit for tat. So you say black can win a5, but I am going to win b7. At the moment that you capture a5, I will capture b7. So I will run with my king to c7, take the pawn, or alternative strategy, at the right moment I push a6, and after b takes a6, I run with my king to c6. And so in one of the cases, of course, one strategy works, and in the other case, the other strategy works. If we look to king c3, right, we are going for changing structure last moment, because if the king takes on a5, the king is on a key square, and we reach one of the defensive key squares, and it's a draw. So that was king c3. Strategy 1. Now we get to king d3, right? Black would say, I'm trying to shield you off from going to e3, and then I'm going to b5. But now we see the tit for tat strategy, king e5, king c4, king d6, king b5, king c7, king takes a5, king takes b7. So whenever you have these pawn endings, you know you can try to change structure and then try to get to one of the defensive key squares. That's one strategy. And sometimes it's possible to run to the one remaining pawn on the opponent's side and capture that pawn at the moment that the opponent king captures your pawn. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again with the next video.